And going live. Hello, everybody, and welcome to another Discussions with a Theist episode with the Atheist Reformation. I'm your host, Drew, as you can tell by the name card down below. Next to me is my friend and co-contributor on Reason Theology. His name is Father Patrick. It's wonderful to have him back again. Thank you for coming on.
You're welcome. It's a pleasure to be back here.
So, today, what the main focus of discussion is supposed to be is we're going to be talking about government, correct?
Yep.
Okay, so why don't I go ahead and let you lead off with that and expound upon your theories and notions, hypotheses, what have you, on what government is, how it should function in society, and what it should do for society.
Right. Well, these are really a discussion topic. I'm just having a sort of a fun discussion,
Right.
throwing a few
Definitely
ideas.
not a debate. This is just kind of to have some fun and have a good discussion.
So, yes, always sort of questions with issues of liberty, freedom, how this works out in society, and then issues of power and politics, the sense of a standard form in which we work with society. So a lot of us come into discussion with libertarian, and how do you have freedom without imposing some sort of control on freedom?
Is my friend.
And what sort of way society works. So it's sort of coming out of these questions. And so my basic hypothesis was actually looking at what happened in the Roman Empire from the time it was Christianized, sort of around about 400 through to its finish in 1453. So we have a sort of 1,000-year-old continuous political system going in place. Even though its land area continually shrank, the political system, in a sense, was stable. And where this was is an interesting mix between church and state. Now, unlike the US, where you have a strict separation of church and state, in the Roman Empire, church and state had separate areas of jurisdiction, separate areas of authority, but they were nevertheless one. The state lived under the rules of the church, and the church lived under the rules of the state. Which raises some interesting questions, which we'll discuss later. Now, the issue of the American system is once you separate church and state, what happens is the state becomes, in a sense, secular. Its worldview, its modus of its being can't take on any particular religious identity. So, in effect, it evolves into a secular thing. And then its decisions are actually made from a secular worldview or an atheistic worldview. But I won't say atheistic. It's a secular worldview. Why to make the distinction is that the people in charge may not necessarily be atheists, but their decisions, their priorities, and everything they're working on are secular values, values that are simply of the human life as it's concerned with its material form, life on earth, without any sort of sense to any metaphysical reality, any transcendent reality. It's just simply the practical day-to-day life, which invariably ends up meaning that its way of thinking, its groundwork, becomes quite secular. And this, in some ways, becomes simply another ideology among religious ideologies. You can't sort of escape some form of worldview or ideological sense in which you frame your existence in life, which you frame your actions. And so strict separation of church and state really actually means that the secular power, with what becomes a secular worldview, essentially dominates. And the moral fiber of society and everything starts to actually drift to secularized values, secularized principles based on humanism, and a sort of an earthly humanism dominates, which actually means that the central core power has its own ideology against the religious people to whom it grants freedom. And then it's sort of who grants the boundaries of freedom, such as we have to have some form of boundaries. Otherwise, you could say, one religion says, well, we have to have human sacrifices. Every day we need to go out and kill 50 people who are not of our religion and sacrifice them to the gods, or the world will come to an end. Now, true religious freedom would say, okay, that's fine. You can go out and kill your 50 people as long as you accept that they'll defend themselves. You might end up being wiped out yourself in this, but if that's true religious freedom. But most societies probably wouldn't want a religious organization that is going around claiming human sacrifices to go and kill 50 people every day. And they
Probably
want to
not.
it.
The Aztecs,
so
I think, were the last ones that were really popular that did that.
Something. But once you do that, what you are actually fundamentally doing is saying that that religion's worldview is a load of rubbish. It's not true, because if it was true, you would allow them to do their 50 sacrifices, because that would stop the world ending. So by making a call that you're not allowed to do that, you are fundamentally making a call that their religious view is rubbish.
So may I point something out here on this one, though? In that we can actually arrive at their purported idea being completely off the rails and rubbish, as you say, without invoking any kind of metaphysicality, usually. Or at least I don't think so. But there again, that could just be because of my lack of understanding of metaphysics, because I have not actually really dove deep into studying it. But what I studied were things like actual physics. Well, not to be dismissive, I studied physics, because initially I was an engineering student. So not to be dismissive towards philosophy or anything like that. There are tons of interesting things about it. But I mean, okay, we talk about the Aztecs sacrificing people to stop the world from ending. Okay. It's a pretty simple experiment. Stop executing people for a week. World didn't end. Don't need to do it. So we didn't have to go through and disprove a particular tenet. We didn't have to disprove any specific doctrine or dogmatic principles or anything like that. All we had to do was observe what is going to happen if we don't do the thing that you say is necessary to prevent Armageddon.
In which case, you still said that their worldview was rubbish because it didn't actually happen.
Well, we would say that that particular practice is rubbish, because when you do experimentation, when you do science and things like that, or an investigation like that, it's about targeting one specific thing and seeing if it works. If it doesn't work, discard it and move on to the next thing.
Yeah. Now, their religious worldview may or may not be adaptable to that. Such a thing. They might have their sacred text, which is a foundational thing, which has just written down in its stone from the god, and therefore they would say, well, that means our stone from God is wrong. So, but anyway, you can see the point that starts coming along. As soon as you start constraining religious groups, in some ways you are imposing or putting down your own value of what is reality upon that religious group. And I think sometimes in modern societies, what we forget is that realistically, you can't escape from some form of worldview, some ideological view. And religious freedom only goes so far as it doesn't infringe the majority's worldview. And in many cases, a lot of the human rights religious freedoms is actually a statement. Actually, we don't believe in any of this to be true. We're not going. As long as you just keep it to yourself in your bedroom, we're not going to complain too much. If you want to meet in public a little bit, as long as you're a bit careful how you do it, we're not going to complain. But ultimately, we don't really believe anything that you're saying. So it's not about a statement that they might all be actually true. It's actually really more of a toleration of their whatever fantasy they wish to go down to keep them happy. So religious rights are actually a little vague in this sense, because they come out of a secularist position, really. And ultimately, if they were to believe any of the religions were true, they would have to say, well, actually, all your religions, what do you think is the right way to deal with everything around us and how we should live together? But that's not what happens. So anyway, that's just a an aside, but you can start seeing there's some actual tensions here for religious groups and stuff there, and you can't escape that there's some predominant worldview or ideological thing which actually is controlling the core of power, the control of the course day-to-day life, wherever it happens to be.
Well, right. So in the United States, or at least what I would hope is the prevailing worldview, not necessarily worldview, but the prevailing governing body about how the American society functions, at least as far as how we deal with our citizens, how we interact with each other, how we address speech, rights, freedom, liberty, all of those things, it would be the United States Constitution, at least in the
Yes.
U.S. And so it doesn't speak anything about religion in of itself, other than you have the freedom to practice whatever you want. But it has a bit of a libertarian bent to it, and I don't necessarily mean libertarian as in the philosophical libertarianism of total free will. We can demonstrate with just a little bit of basic biology that there cannot be any such thing as libertarian free will. For instance, you and I can't decide to just stop eating and not eventually die because of it due to malnutrition.
Oh, but we can
I
actually
might
decide to stop eating.
I might last a little bit longer because I got a little bit more to
We're not
work with,
driven
but
by our desire to eat. We can actually say, no, I'm not going to eat. And of course, we will die.
right, exactly. So libertarian free will, in that essence, it very well cannot be true, because there are biological things that tell us you need to eat. If you do not eat, you will die. And we cannot control that urge. We can't stop that, so we don't have the free will to stop it. But that's beside the point. The libertarianism that I'm kind of referring to is not even libertarianism as what is largely described as libertarianism in politics, which is a pale comparison to what it actually was supposed to stand for. But that's beside the point here. Is that government shall make no law establishing a particular state religion. This does not mean that religious groups do not have a voice. They can have a voice. They can speak to those in power. They have every right to do so, just like every other Joe Blow citizen in the United States does. And I wouldn't want to regulate that. I wouldn't want to stop someone from saying that. But that being said, that should also invite the consequence of people are allowed to criticize and talk about and even go so far as to denigrate people. Like, I'm one of those, I guess you could say, radical types of people that I believe essentially all speech is permissible, aside from a couple of landmark cases that involve incitement, calling people to action, in particular towards an action of violence or panic. Those things I disagree with, but on the whole, I believe a person should be able to say whatever they want to say, no matter how potentially profound or despicably disgusting, because they have the right to do that. They should have the right to do that, because it kind of goes back on to one of my favorite quotes from Carl Sagan: the best disinfectant for bad ideas is simply sunlight.
Yeah, actually, I'm pretty much of the same view, and that's partly though I am religious and I have a
Mm-hmm.
particular worldview, and I'd like to see that as the worldview at which we all follow. Nevertheless, it's actually predicated on this on the sense of freedom, and that's fundamental to it. And also to self-preserve myself when I am a minority, freedom is actually there. Now, this takes me on to the next point, actually, which is rather than talk about human rights of religious, what we're talking really about is tolerance. Where you're in a
Okay.
society which tolerates the variations of people's opinions. In other words, you're not going to suppress them and wipe them out for your particular view. So, bedrock
Right.
of the U.S. understanding is a state that the state will be tolerant of a variety of views. You think what you like, and you're not going to
Well,
be prosecuted by the state.
it's not even quite so much as that. It actually is a bit more specific. When you look at things, in particular the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments of the U.S. Constitution, it says very specific language. These are essentially negative rights, and what I mean by that, and what is generally meant by scholarship at large, is that these are not these are things that people already have. These are things that the government cannot infringe upon. So in essence, the way the Constitution is written and the Bill of Rights is to force government compliance and force government tolerance of other views, of alternate viewpoints. And so it's forced upon the entity of the government itself, but not the people.
Yeah. That's right. It's sort of well, it does to a certain degree to the people. Obviously, as people form the governments, etc., there's a certain level of tolerance required from the whole population to each other to be a
Right.
member of.
We have to agree to go along to get along for the most part.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
that's an important thing, and I think that's a good part of the states. Um, Now, so just as an emphasis again, sort of on there is a state of tolerance, and I say tolerance because that means it's said, well, I've got my views, but I'll allow you to have your views without crushing them out. It doesn't
Mm-hmm.
deny my own views or say we're all equal or anything like that. No, they can all be different, and some can be better, some can be worse, but we will not prosecute you based on your goodness or badness or what you actually think.
Right.
And the other point I was just going to say about freedom of speech, it just has come to my mind as we were talking. I think there's a distinction to be made between free speech, which is a speech appealing to reason, and speech appealing simply to emotion. So that I think there's going to be a distinction to be here. So a speech is just simply arousing emotion to incite violence, to make people give an emotional response, to act in an emotional way that is not grounded in reason, is speech that in some ways can be constrained to a limited degree. But of course, everything blurs. But
Yes,
but
very
because
much so.
true freedom, no, is a freedom of reason. It's a freedom of logic, the freedom to express yourself and make a reasoned arguments, even if you disagree with it. And some of the reasoned arguments may lead to some very troubling conclusions. But nevertheless, as long as it's a reasoned argument put out and it's not simply stirring up an emotional response for an emotional response, though someone like Jordan Peterson will give a reasoned argument and stir up emotional responses in some of those listening.
Right. Well, it's not so much just stirring up responses of those that are listening and whatnot, but you also have the issue of I believe that people should be allowed to have impassioned speech, emotional speech, and should be allowed to make arguments that target an emotional response, provided that emotional response is not to incite violence. And in essence, I would think that you actually might be in agreement with me on this particular point. Um, I'm not saying that you hold to these views or anything like that, but if we were to regulate against, say, just purely emotive speech or pure someone who is making a speech based entirely on targeting emotion and nothing to do with providing a reasoned argument, well, that would actually lead to the shutting down of public speech of several religious groups just in this country alone. In particular, organizations like the New Independent Fundamental Baptists, who are famous for being rather out there on a few things. Um, Essentially, any anti-evolution sermon essentially would fall into that category at that point because they ultimately end in emotional arguments. You can see this from just about every mega church pastor, at least in the Dallas area, that has recorded sermons and stuff like that and posted them online talking about evolution. And again, I know it's Drew. He's bringing up evolution again. Oh gosh, watch out. I'm not trying to steer the conversation that way. It's just that's where the majority of my experience lies in as far as dealing with people who make those arguments.
Yeah. No, I can see your point, and I haven't suggested the distinction. I'm wary that you've got to be careful with that distinction because I'm not a fan of hate speech. People talk about this hate speech because it's very quickly, well, what do you define as hate speech, and where do you shift from reason to emotion? Now,
See,
the thing is that
I don't think you can actually have an objective definition of what hate speech is, and here's why I say that is that hate speech itself is an emotionally subjective term. It automatically has to be hate speech. Okay, speech we can identify and define objectively. Hate, on the other hand, hate is something that is purely emotionally driven. It is inherently subjective. It is inescapable that it is inherently subjective. So no law that any person could make that any government could make trying to legislate against hate speech is going to do so on a subjective basis, and there will never be any objectivity to it. We see this, in fact, in your home country, the UK, where people are getting arrested and put in jail. I don't know if they're actually going to prison under a conviction or anything like that, but at the very least being put in jail, prosecuted, fined, and in some cases extending their stay in jail after prosecution and conviction for saying something online that is not necessarily inflammatory, does not incite violence, but is something that is just cruel to someone. Should they say cruel things? No. There should be a level of decorum when conversing with other people, especially in the public space. Does that mean you should be precluded from being, pardon my terms here, should that mean you should be precluded from being a raging asshole about things? No. You have the right to be.
Well, this is why actually, no, I don't really disagree with you too much on this.
Okay.
But again, I think this is why I'm talking about distinction between emotive and reason. Because at least then, if it's reasonable, then the average person, you could put a reasonable test. Is it reasonable? And the person goes, well, there's some reason behind what he's saying. I might not agree with it, but I can see that there's a reasoned attempt. So to pass the reason test, all you need to demonstrate is to the average person that there is some sort of reason or logic or coherence of one view. So it may be disagreed with, it may be a little bit flawed, but at least it's an attempt to make a reasoned case. And if it can't get to that stage, then most people go, that's not a reason thing. If you just rant and kill them. But,
right, exactly.
You can say, well, I can't see a reasonable average person could do, because I think I'm a strong believer that reason is actually something we can gauge with. So I'm not an absolute relativist. No, I'm more of an absolutist in a sense, and I do believe in reason, that we can have a conversation and we can come to a truth through reason, that through the process of discussion, logic, we can share an idea, that we can come to a common ground on a particular point. And we might have different bits of evidence and stuff which we're trying to work with, and therefore come to different ground on different reasons because we're basing the weight of our evidence differently. But then we can argue, well, I'm putting more weight on that, and you go, oh yeah, I can understand why you were doing that, and where you get that, because and I can understand your position based on your position, So we.
Mm-hmm. So what I might say on that one is I'm not going to say necessarily we can arrive purely at truth through engaging in reason. I mean, I think we can get most of the way there for sure. And a lot of it has to come down to something I've kind of been starting to look into more and more recently is epistemology. Is how do we know what we know, and moreover, how do we know, that sort of thing. And so you come across things, in particular, two distinct types of reasoning. There's kind of a third type that's a bit wishy-washy in the definition, I think, but we're not going to worry about that one right now. And that is inductive and deductive reasoning. So with inductive reasoning, this is the kind of reasoning you see employed in the science classroom, in academia, and things like that. We work from the bottom up. We start with a hypothesis, we test the hypothesis. Either it succeeds or it fails. If it succeeds, okay, great, we move on to the next thing. But just because that hypothesis stood one time does not mean it is going to stand every time. So constant retesting needs to be done. We are never going to know anything with certainty, but it gives us genuine content about the universe, a posteriori knowledge. And so that's the kind of thing that I'm in for. I'm not worried about not having pure certainty about any particular thing. What I'm worried about is being as maximally certain as I possibly can on something based on the given evidence that we have compiled and built up successively over time through continued testing, continued experimentation, and continued discussion. Whereas with deductive reasoning, which is one of the primary reasoning methods of classical philosophy and classical apologetics, is top down. It's entirely top down argumentation. Like, for instance, it kind of attempts to lean towards inductive reasoning a little bit with things like, say, the Kalam cosmological argument. but it doesn't get all the way. In fact, it can't. In fact, the Kalam cosmological argument doesn't actually get to a God. It can only get as far as saying the universe had a beginning. But that's where induction takes you. It doesn't give you certainty, but it does give you actual content about reality. A priori knowledge, or the deductive knowledge derived through deduction, it doesn't really give us genuine content about reality, but it does give us certainty. But that certainty can still be wrong when induction is applied to it. And so I think that a deductive argument can definitely get us to a testable hypothesis, but ultimately it's going to rely on induction and inductive reasoning to tell us whether or not that deduction is accurate. They have to work together. And I think
Yeah.
that's where a lot of problems with discussion about philosophy uh, get get drawn in and just mired in this muck, whether it be government, whether it be religion, whether it be science, any topic. It's because some person is looking at it from the top down, another from the bottom up, and there's no overlap. They're just stuck in what they're talking about. They don't even want to consider what the other person is doing. And that's what you see in most debates these days. They're not actually having a discussion. They're not trying to relay a point. They're just waiting for their turn to speak, which I think is one of the reasons why I like doing my show this way, because it's essentially just a phone call between two acquaintances, and we just happen to do it in front of other people who can also interact and chime in on the conversation, which I sincerely hope that they do, because at the end of the day, this is just two people with two not even entirely different viewpoints having a discussion. That's nowhere near enough to arrive at what I would consider an actual consensus. And so that's why I want more interaction, why I want more people watching stuff like this, because that's what drives the discussion forward, I think.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, there's a constraint of debate, and too many people are actually not willing to actually listen, as you say, to the other party, and to have a reasoned discussion coming to a common mind means you must listen. You must be able to hear what the other person's, and you must then be able to think in the other way with the other person's thinking, and unpack for them the things that may be a barrier for them connecting to what you are thinking, and things like that. And if you don't actually can't engage with the way that they are thinking, then, as you say, you might as well be talking to a brick wall because you're not going to actually get anywhere. Because the key thing to get someone on the other mind to come with yours is to actually say something in some way which is convincing to them that your understanding, your point of view, or etc., has some merit to it for them to start engaging with it. So yes, as you say, these discussions, which are actually more open-ended, with not trying to push any particular end game, are actually more beneficial. But no, I do agree that the thing about being humans, of course, is we don't know what we don't know. We are
Gotta love
inherently
tautologies,
limited
right?
at knowledge. And for me, this is basically anything, any belief or any sort of worldview or statement we have as a general overview of how we see reality is itself a statement of faith, because we simply don't know what we don't know. We don't know how much of the knowledge we actually know is in proportion to all the knowledge there is to know. We might have one piece of a jigsaw puzzle. We go, hey, well, this is a big job, exercise. And then actually when you see all the rest of the pieces, oh, and even though your little limited view is really coherent, I made a beautiful understanding of this little piece here. When you put it into a much larger piece and suddenly go, oh, that's not right. So because we just don't know what we don't know, and so we can make certain sense of what we do know around us and do things that make
Right.
it work. But you can never really escape a sense of faith, and that's what you're doing by induction. You're basically saying
Well,
that,
I suppose it would actually have to boil down to how we are defining faith, because there are two distinct definitions of faith. One is a more common colloquial definition, in that faith is just confidence, essentially, at which point the term is rather meaningless in my eyes. The other one is a bit more descriptive, and it specifically talks about religion, and it goes back to that I can never remember the actual citation for the verse, but I do remember it's a biblical one. Faith is in things not seen. Essentially, it is faith. It is belief absent evidence,
Yeah,
as
yeah. I think
described from a
yeah,
at least from a Judeo-Christian, or really primarily a Christian theological perspective. And so I I have a bit of a problem with saying that, say, someone who is an evolutionary biologist or an astrophysicist talking about the Big Bang or talking about biological evolution, what have you, and things like that, is operating from a position of faith that, for any reason, with regards to the evidence that is involved there, because there is evidence. And
yeah, yeah. No,
so it's well reasoned about, yes, that piece, but that does not necessarily entail that that person is going to have faith about other things outside of that.
yeah. I suppose what I'm talking about is specifically here. Yes, in a specific context of, say, making your machines work and things, you have a faith that the things will at least be continuous and not randomly go in and out, so you can have a show for an hour and the things will
But still,
continue to work. You can even
that still
start to,
boils down to,
it's not randomly. That's a certain level of faith and confidence. But the other
it's a certain level
level
of
of faith,
confidence, but I wouldn't say it is faith, because
well,
I can
it's sort
demonstrate
of
that it's worked in the past,
trust
and so I know
that,
that I can make
that
this thing work.
from experience, you've sort of got a certain trust that the things in front of you won't suddenly disappear for 5 seconds and reappear for 5 seconds later. Your sense of stability in the world of the material objects around you through most of your life is established, that you have confidence. Now, you don't actually know for sure
No, but
that.
it's well apportioned based on the evidence.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
it's still,
So,
at the end of the day, it is still not faith.
well, it's a certain faith because you don't absolutely know that it's going to not disappear, because you don't know
No,
everything.
I'm
So
actually not convinced that we can absolutely know anything.
exactly. So there's always a little stuff. Now, the other thing I was talking about faith is a sense of, there's a sense of the overall picture of reality which we sort of carry with us. And that is the sense of faith. Unless you can tell me you know everything, whether you choose, sort of, I start from a basic atheist model, is no God, everything's just material. That's my working hypothesis of reality, or I work from the hypothesis there is a God, etc. I think these are sort of statements by which everybody has. You have to have
But
some
see,
form of.
that's where I think that disconnect comes in, though, because you're saying that someone like me, not necessarily me specifically, but you're saying someone like me with an atheistic worldview is starting from a point of there is no God. That's not the case at all. My belief is a portion based on the evidence that I have access to. I have yet to find any evidence indicating that a deity exists. Therefore, my apportioned belief based on that evidence is one of not being convinced. So this is not a faith statement in any shape, way, or form. This is purely apportioned confidence based on evidence or lack thereof. I'm not saying that no deity exists. I'm not going to say that no deity exists. To say that with such a level of certainty flies in the face of how I approach reality, of how I apportion my beliefs. That doesn't mean I'm going to be convinced by the next argument that comes along or anything like that. It's going to have some very serious evidence backing it up. And so that actually
Mhm.
brings me to another point of people. I've been asked multiple times on Stump the Apologist, what would it take to make me believe, to make me a believer again? Uh, and I have to defer to someone like Matt Dillahunty, because he said it better than I ever could really come up with, and that is, if a God exists, and that God is exactly as described by whatever that person's chosen religion is, and they have omnipotence, omnipresence, omnibenevolence, all these things, then then that deity knows precisely what it would take to convince me that they exist, and they have not yet chosen to do so.
Yes, though there is a question on it. I think
Okay.
still though, where yes, I say there is a statement of an atheist who says there is no God. Now you're probably more actually in the agnostic camp, which
Probably
which
so.
is
Well,
which But maybe not exactly. Agnostic particularly actually denies that you can know. And I don't think you're at that
Right.
stage of
No, I
denying that you
don't deny
can
that we
know.
can know. What I say as of right now, and I know people kind of refer to this as just weak atheism or as just, pop culture atheism, but honestly, this is the best descriptor, the best label for me if you really want to label me. And that is one of an agnostic atheist. I don't know that a deity doesn't exist, but I don't believe one exists because there's not evidence to influence my knowledge one way or the other. When it comes to can we know that a deity exists, I would say at the closest I would come to saying that is not right now, because we have no instrumentation, no method of measurement by which we can determine whether or not anything supernatural exists or whether or not the supernatural exists. Because again, I work from a position of testable hypotheses and repeatable conclusions as time goes on. And so to get to God, to get to any God, for me, it has to be from the bottom up. We have to test and experiment our way all the way up to the top. And so before we even talk about a deity or the aspects of that deity, we still have to breach the issue of, does the supernatural exist? How do we show that it exists if it does? And can we show it? And if we can't, Occam's razor dictates that the simplest explanation is often the most correct. So that in this particular instance, based on all the evidence, the appropriate apportioned belief should be that the supernatural, as far as we can tell, doesn't exist unless shown otherwise in the future. And that's my caveat, is unless shown otherwise, because it hasn't been shown yet, but I cannot rule out that it could be.
Yeah, I suppose you're still making what I'm saying is you're making a statement. Your working hypothesis, your default position is, by Occam's razor, so far as you've understood, that there is no God. Now, this is in a sense still a state of belief, because you're not sure for sure, but you default to that as your initial model. You have to have some
Right.
way of thinking about it.
I essentially operate from the position of the null hypothesis. My position can never be proven, ever. There is no way to prove that I'm right about anything, and there necessarily cannot be, because I occupy the purely negative. I don't believe because I am unconvinced, because I do not see evidence. I can't prove that there's no evidence. I can't prove that there's, well, I can prove that there's not evidence right now, but I can't prove that there will never be evidence. And so my position can very well and very easily be disproven with evidence. But without it, it still stands. And for me, the way I've learned about things, the way I understand science, the way I understand reality, is that, at least for the time being, I believe my position to be the most correct position to hold, based on what we can show, what we can demonstrate. And we can't demonstrate those things. But this still does not fall to faith in any way. I don't have faith that we'll never find anything. I don't have faith in anything that
Ah,
does not have evidence. I do
yeah,
not
yeah.
have
No, no,
that.
yeah,
What
yeah.
I
No,
and
I
so
think
and
it's a
so
sort of
that's
slight
where that's where I
different.
that's where I have my hang
Yeah,
up
yeah.
on the word faith.
Yeah, I can see what you're saying. I think I'm using faith in a slightly different
You're
meaning.
using it more in the colloquial sense as confidence and trust, which I
Well,
feel
I, I,
kind of just
I'm using it
nullifies
in
the
a,
word and makes it rather
I'm
meaningless.
actually using it in a slightly different sense to
Okay.
both of those, whereas I'm using it in more of a creedal sense, that I have faith in one God, the maker of heaven and earth. It's a statement of facts of what reality is. So it's not like I can say it's been proven or not proven or anything like that. I suppose I have a sense of, yeah, I'm using this more of that. This is my statement of what reality is. This is the working model from which I'm
Right, this is
working
your
from,
hypothesis.
from reality. We can prove or disprove it at some
Hmm.
stage of this, but that's my working model of existence. Your working model is not that, but you're open to be that. You're not in any particular faith that can't or not be proven or not proven. I can say I have sort of more. Actually, I'm sort of in a similar boat as you, and my point is that there are evidences that you can know God, etc. I see a whole lot of saints who've gone through a whole lot of that. I've met people who've done that. I've experienced things myself, which tend to give me evidence to say that the God exists. Now, whether that would convince you or not is another matter. And I don't think there's any evidence which is absolutely compulsively to kind of convince anybody of anything, simply again because we don't know what we don't know. And so any particular piece of evidence can say, well, there's another explanation for that piece of evidence if they so choose to find it's uncomfortable to believe it, or whatever reason they might not want.
But see, here's the thing though, is we don't is it's not that we're looking for other explanations of evidence. That's not what science does. That's not the framework that I work with. Explanations are derived from the evidence is what drives the explanation. In that sense, like we don't take an explanation and apply it to evidence. We take all the evidence together and look and see what does this evidence tell us, and what can it show us. So we are deriving the explanation from the evidence. We are not attaching an explanation to it. Absent it.
I don't know if I quite agree with that entirely. While I accept that you are not predetermining an explanation for the evidence and therefore pulling the evidence up to fit your predetermined explanation, I agree with that completely. I don't think that the evidence in itself is such that you are forced by the evidence to have to choose a particular explanation of it. I think at some level there is some way that you, in explaining the evidence, you're having to be a little bit creative. You have to be a little bit inventive, but that's good because that's helping people to think more about what reality is. But there is still a sense of human creativity about what
no system is ever going to be perfect. Like it's all going to be based on our five senses, how we interact with the world around us, how we interact with reality. It's always going to be predicated on what happens right here. But that's why we have a scientific community. That's why we have the principle of peer review. It's so we can hand this off to other, to other primates like ourselves and say, here, this is the evidence that I discovered. This is the result of my experiment, and I think this actually fits the prediction made with my hypothesis. Test this. Try and break it, because that's what the scientific community does. They go through it, they do their experimentation, they form their hypothesis, have the experiment, and they record the results, and then they submit it to peer review. And it's submitted entirely for the purpose of having every single one of their colleagues that is within the same field of them to take that paper and do everything they can to tear it into tiny pieces, hand it back to them on a platter and say, sorry, Jim, you screwed up, let's try again. And then take that, if that's what happens, and then go back and do it again. And do it either more correctly, make sure there's no mistakes this time, or make sure to reform the hypothesis and make a different prediction and see if that holds out. And then if it does, it moves on until it eventually becomes a theory, like the theory of evolution, or the theory of gravity, or the germ theory of disease. All of these things are, as a lot of theists, not you have never said this. I'll say this right now, so don't anybody get confused. Father Patrick has never said this to my knowledge. These things are just theories, because they don't understand what theory means in a scientific sense. They only know their basic colloquial dictionary sense, at which point, colloquially, theory and hypothesis actually kind of have the same definition, is just, this is what I think about that. Not, this is the best explanation, given all of this evidence that we have stacked up over, in some cases, centuries, to show that this is the most accurate model of reality right now. Could it change? Yes. Science is always tentative. It is always tentative acceptance based on evidence. And when that evidence changes, then science must, by its very nature, change. And religion, on the whole, with the top-down looking at reality, doesn't really allow for that very much. You might get tiny tweaks here and there, but the core of it never actually changes.
Yes.
The core beliefs don't change, even if evidence comes out showing it to be showing contrariness to
Well,
it.
yeah. Well, actually, yeah. So religion's a little different way, of course, because you sense you've got the omnipotent being who knows all, knows everything, saying this is what reality is, and if you want to participate properly in reality, then you will follow my instructions on how to do so, because I know what reality is. And so you're starting with the groundwork of the being who does know everything and all. He doesn't need to test in everything as we do as humans, and therefore, if he's given his instructions, this is the best way, then either you can simply to follow the instructions and discover, yes, it is the best way, or you can try to prove from not following or something like that this isn't the best way. But then you have to put the criteria, what is the best way, etc., to define what is.
And the thing is that I would accept that if we could show that a God existed, number one. But we can't say that the Bible itself is evidence that a God exists. We just can't. Otherwise, every holy book that's ever been written or published is evidence that that particular deity exists. Well, I'm getting to a different point.
I think it's not proof that God exists, but
it's
you
not
can
evidence.
Say
Is what I'm saying. It's not evidence. Excuse me.
Evidence on the pile which you can add to the discussion. You can't just discard it. There's some evidence there.
No, I don't discard it. I don't discard it, but I don't consider it evidence. What I consider it to be is the claim. Because this is the holy book. This is the book from which the religion or religions are derived. This is how they distill their dogma, how they distill their doctrine is from this book. So this book is not evidence for their point. To me, it is the claim that their point is accurate, and it needs to be examined as we would examine any other claim. And to me, I find it rather wanting, because like I would accept your premise of, okay, if an all-powerful deity exists and this deity knows everything and has always known everything, and we can just simply go along with what that deity says, okay, fine. If we can show that deity exists and that deity can demonstrate that they are correct, yeah, sure, okay, follow them. But the thing is, the Bible doesn't show this. The Bible is not like it is not written by God. It is written by people. It is asserted that it is divinely inspired, but at the end of the day, it is still written by people. It is not the literal words of a deity. These are people's individual attestations as to what the words of the deity are.
Well, actually, some of the Bible is claiming to be what the words the deity has given to the persons, and there's other parts which are attestations to what the person's seen or experienced.
I would say to an extent that they're all attestations, because again, it is still a person who has written it down. God didn't write the book of Job. A person did.
Yeah, I suppose I understand what you're saying. I think why I caveat on that is. Okay. Well, you're correct. As a human being has written it down,
right. And so we can't we can't demonstrate that they were divinely inspired to do that. We just know that they wrote that down.
I can't turn around and say that they weren't divinely inspired and that the words aren't the words of God either. So I can't define it as not being the words of God.
No, I'm not saying it's not.
Well, you're sort of slipping into that. That's why I was caveating. I was questioning.
Right. No, I understand the caveat for it. No, and I understand where you're going with that. And there are people who would try to turn around and make that exact argument. I am not making that argument, nor would I ever, because that, again, would fly in the face of how I understand reality, how I interact with the world around me. It would be entirely disingenuous of me to do that, and would be completely inconsistent with how I look at things. I do not see it as the divinely inspired word of God. I see it as the words of a man who wrote something down who believes that those words may have been the divinely inspired word of God. I'm not going to sit there and say that that person who wrote it down did not believe that they were writing what God was telling them to write. But that doesn't mean that God told them to write it. And
No,
so I'm not saying that it's not the word of God, but I'm also saying we cannot assume that it is, and that it
no,
is
no,
inappropriate to do so. It is to me intellectually dishonest to do so,
no.
and I
I
don't
agree
mean
with
that disparagingly. That's just that, like, the way I reason through things.
Yeah, no, I agree with that point. Yes, the claim that it is the God, yes, it could be the very word of God, but that the fact is that someone claims it doesn't mean it actually is. So we
Right.
sit in the pile of yes, it may indeed be what the God has or the world has told us, but just by the mere fact it's written and saying that this is what the God doesn't actually prove that it is what the God of the world, of the universe, of reality, or whatever being it is, or whatever we're talking about, has actually inspired this person to write.
And
Yeah.
see,
Now,
that's kind of what's caused me to, and I'm kind of going off on a little bit of a tangent here, kind of a not doxological, a theological tangent I'm going off on a little bit here, and I hope you permit me to do that for a moment. Is that's what makes me think things like these, like all these different ecumenical councils that have happened throughout the centuries and things like that. I can't bring myself to trust that they're being accurate, that they're being, um, ingenuous about it, or not being disingenuous about things, because these are essentially men that are people that are deciding, in essence, in most cases, hundreds of years after the fact of when any of these events are supposedly happening, and in some cases, with the way certain aspects were termed in, like, the King James Bible, thousands of years after the events supposedly happened, and they're sitting there and they're tweaking things and whatnot, and so I'm always forced to wonder, this is undergoing what is seemingly constant revision, but at the same time it is still being stated that this is the ineffable, unflappable, inerrant word of a deity. Now, I get sorting out forgeries from earlier documents and stuff like that. That's all well and good. Like, for instance, I wouldn't want the 6th century forgery of Irenaeus being attributed to Irenaeus. But at the
yeah,
same
yeah,
but at the same time, I would find it very odd if, say, Photius started editing the words of Irenaeus, saying, "Oh, this is what he really meant," when they're separated by 600 years.
yeah. No, look, that's fine. I mean, from an orthodox point of view, theologically,
Hmm.
our test of whether the council is true is there actually it is consistent that nothing has changed in reasoned application. You can look at it and you can make a valid reasoned position that nothing has actually changed. That these councils weren't trying to revise and tweak things. They were simply trying to make sure that those who were trying to tweak and revise things were shut up and told, no, don't do that. This is what has actually been received. This is what we've all tested. That here's over here. We all agree that this is
Okay.
what we've received. What you've said is not what we've agreed. And this is the Orthodox approach. It is to maintain this, because this is what the ecumenical councils are about, is maintaining this consistency. And I'm convinced of it because there is a consistency. There is a logical coherency to everything that is said. There's a logical coherency through all the books of the Bible, etc. Now, it doesn't mean there's not issues about who describes what fact, how, and why, and the different descriptions of attestation of what happened, which is natural to all human witnesses in a sense, but more deeper issues of the actual theology which has been put in there, what has actually been expressed. There is a deep coherency and consistency, as far as I can see, in my study with everything going. That's why I'm convinced by it. So that I find is a challenging piece of evidence, is how can we have something which is so fundamentally consistent, coherent over such a long time that it can maintain itself as such, because we can definitely see so many things do revise, do get changed, do get updated. So this type of thing is evidence as such of something maintaining it in a sense of consistency and reaffirming a sense of God who is reason.
But at the same
But
time,
anyway,
the same something similar could also be said, in that the reason it's being maintained is because it's being maintained. It's not necessarily that a deity is maintaining it. It's all these different councils seem to have a vested interest in maintaining a continuity, and so they do. And so there's an entirely naturalistic explanation for that, in in that it is much simpler to operate under the guise that the reason the document is as close as it is to what we have from older papyri and things like that is because of active maintenance done by people over time.
Yeah, no, you're right. There is a sense of wanting to maintain it, is an active sense of maintaining it. I
Right,
think
so that doesn't
it's a
indicate
question
that a
of
deity
that
exists or that a
that
deity is insisting on the maintaining of it. Is all what I'm saying there.
no, well, the question is that how good an ability have humans got in actually maintaining something as consistent as it is at such a complete, complex, different level of understanding what's going on. I mean, these are not simplistic thoughts. This is a level of
Well,
complexity into relations of ideas
I
and
would
thoughts and
say
things.
that we actually don't have anything to indicate one way or the other. Like when you look at religious texts and the consistency, any consistency that's been maintained over long periods of time and things like that, it's you can easily attribute that to there being a vested interest in maintaining the belief, maintaining the organization, so to speak, maintaining the continuity of the divine literature, if you will. And so we don't there's not really a good way to you can't really test that against other things like, say, a comic book or a fiction series or even the works of Plato or Aristotle. We really can't butt those up against each other and compare the two in that sense, because we really only working with a sample size of a few things. Like we're working with the sample size of what I would argue three. And here's my justification behind that. A sample size of three, in that you have the maintenance over long periods of time of the Tanakh in the Jewish Torah, which does have some textual discrepancies with the modern Christian Old Testament. We have the Christian Bible itself and all of its different versions, but I'm just including that as a sample of one because ultimately it goes back to essentially a singular source that they're trying to maintain. While different versions may happen as a result of that, we're still working with a single source, a single point of maintenance here. And then you have the Quran that imams and Islamic scholars have worked to maintain over the course of the existence of their religion, of their belief system. And so we there's not really any other kind of documents other than religious documents that see this level of continuous maintenance over long periods of time that we can show, because it seems as though if there are people, trying to maintain the works of Aristotle or trying to maintain the works of Plato or Socrates or Democritus or Anaximander, yes, I'm referencing a lot of Greek people right now, but these are the ones that initially come to mind, is that people don't really people for whatever reason either tended to not write down why they were maintaining these things or if they were being maintained, other than here's a copy of the thing. I copied the original thing, or if they even say that they did, and then handed the thing to the next person. And so that's where that game of telephone can happen. But with religious documents, I would say yes, there's always going to be inherent consistency, because if it is, I have no reason to disbelieve what you're saying is that it is councils of people that are trying to preserve continuity, trying to preserve the original message. Yes, there's going to be inherent consistency maintained over a long period of time, I think.
Yeah, I think though I'm also talking about not just the consistency of the text, which you're right, there is a certain level of just normal human thing. I'm talking also about the bigger worldview, the ideas, the theology that this text is reflecting. So I don't come from the view that I'm deriving my understanding of reality from the text. The text is a witness to the understanding of reality which I share with other people from the time of Christ, or even before. And it's a testimony to that. Yes, it's an important document to share, but it's not that which I'm interested in preserving in the end in itself. It's the
No,
ideas,
it's the
the
worldview, it's the
theology
message
behind
itself.
it. And that's where it's more interesting. Now, you've also got some of the Hindu texts, etc., and you've got the
Yeah,
Buddhist
yeah.
texts. You've got the Buddhist ideas.
The Buddhist texts
You've got blatant.
are a little bit, are, at least from what I've seen from historical records, seem to be a little bit less reliable. They're not so much concerned with preserving the specific wordings as much as they are just the overall message.
Yeah,
Whereas,
yes, yeah.
and that's why I reference specifically the Abrahamic faiths and things like that, because they seem more intent on preserving particular wordings themselves in an originalistic textual sense, rather than just preserving the idea of things like with Buddhism and things like that. That's why I didn't include that one in my little
No,
off
no,
the
you're
cuff
right.
list.
But this is what I think: the Abrahamic texts, religions, unlike Buddhism, for example, and Platonism is again another one where you
Hmm.
preserve Plato's original documents, but it evolves into Neoplatonism, and the ideas sort of preserved, but have a certain evolution across the centuries. Now,
Right, but
Christianity
also
and
Platonism was designed to evolve because Plato wanted his ideas to be consistent with reality, and so they were
it's
inherently designed to change.
yeah, so it's an idea which is it's run into it's an explanation to reality. Whereas Abrahamic, there is a the idea, but it's, as I said, it comes from the claim is that it comes from the omnipotent, all-knowing deity. This is his testimony of what he believes or wants to share about what reality is with us. And it's also grounded in a physical sense in our physical reality, being spiritual. So that part of that grounding, that connection, that this deity, and this is a strong claim from Christian, the Abrahamic faiths, is that actually the God has grounded himself in the creation. So when we are not dealing with just something that is an abstraction. We're claiming it has a tangible reality as well as something transcendent as well. But it meets the earth, which is quite a claim. It's to a sense,
It
allows
is quite a claim,
yourself to
yeah.
start falsifying it because you go, well, actually, the history, blah, 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 blah. Anyway, right, shall we go back to governance for a little bit?
Yes, actually, we should go back to governance. However, I would like to take a detour for a brief moment. We have had some questions and whatnot come
Yep.
into the chat and things like that, and statements, and it's a relatively short one, so I figure we can go ahead and knock everything out. I'll start with just the most recent one. KCA Randy jumping back on saying greetings at Drew. KCA Randy, nice to see you back, man. Thanks for tuning in. We've got more coming. We're back. There's no longer a hiatus going on. So plan on seeing more content in the future. Thanks for sticking around all this time. Now going back to the top and answering just in kind of chronological order. Patrick J says, I'm pretty sure that the U.S. had blasphemy laws in the past, though. Not at the federal level, they didn't. At least not as far as I'm aware. That was something that was not it was not consistent with the Constitution. It wasn't consistent with the First Amendment and the decisions and descriptions thereof. There were states that had blasphemy laws and things like that, but when challenged in the Supreme Court and challenged in the judiciary, they all failed because, again, establishing a blasphemy law even at a state level is against the Constitution because it is making a rule towards the establishment of a state level religion. Constitution says no mas, not allowed to do that. Government stays out of religion. Religion, for the most part, stays out of government in as much as it is not part of the government. My younger brother says hi. That's cool. Patrick asks, Father Patrick, what would you say about laws against blasphemy and sodomy?
Um,
He said with regards to the earlier conversation that we had.
yeah,
I think he's talking about the conversation we had on Stump the Apologist with blasphemy laws.
stuff
But
like that.
let's just focus on the core question. Yeah, there.
Yeah, look, there's sort of multiple ways of answering this. I think that generally I'm opposed to making any specific legislation against blasphemy at a government level, simply because, in the sense of tolerating other people's beliefs and their expression, it becomes extremely dangerous to sort of define what's blasphemy or not. And you can make there's two types, I suppose, of, I'm just quickly thinking as off the top of my head, but I can distinguish. there's a thing that can be said as a blasphemy, which is actually a theological statement made from your position on a particular point. And this actually goes across to also what Christians sometimes say, maybe about homosexuals and stuff like this. This is the type of thing that people got kicked off the rugby team because he made a comment about homosexuals. Now, to me, this is like, shouldn't be punished, because this is a statement from their particular belief system made in coherently in that sense, which may be taken offensively or blasphemely by somebody else in another belief system, but it's not actually targeted at rubbishing the other person per se. It's just simply a statement of your own belief system, which is well grounded in your belief system, which someone outside that may or may not take offense at that particular blasphemy. Then there's a blasphemy which is sort of specifically targeting someone else's other religion. So if I'm a Christian and I talk about Muhammad and call him a pig or something like that, then I'm blasphemous. It's a sort of an attack on him.
You've said something that is Islamically blasphemous.
But it's nothing. I've got no. It's not based on my own faith. I can say he's not a real prophet or anything, but to say that's just sort of rudeness. And now I probably wouldn't legislate against either, but I certainly find the latter is not something which should be really done in public speech. And I find people who want to justify themselves to that sort of behavior as really unhelpful for the constitution of the states, where it's about tolerance of other religions. That's sort of an act of intolerance as such. But that's to be distinguished between a statement that Muhammad isn't a prophet, which I'm making from the basis of my own religious belief. And I think that certainly shouldn't be there. So I'd prefer to have no laws on it to not get this confused. Because I think in the hate speech crime, which we talked about earlier, this kind of stuff is starting to get confused, and it's not helpful.
Yeah, and see, that's why with as inherently subjective as the term itself, hate speech is, there's no objective way to define something like that. I would, because effectively what it's boiling down to is that hate speech is any speech that you hate. At least that's the way people are looking at it. But everybody hates things differently. Everybody has different levels of hate. Everyone has different worldview. Some people don't hate at all, or at least they claim not to. My thing is this: is like, you know what? I hate bigoted speech. I hate when people use racially charged language to try and make a point, because to me, your point is now immediately null and void because you have said something to deliberately denigrate a subset of humans based entirely on generally an immutable physical characteristic. I hate when people do that. I despise when people do that. Do I believe they have the right to say such horrible, disgusting things? Yes, I very much do. Should they be allowed to? Yes. Because if they're allowed to say that publicly, and they're dumb enough to say that publicly, that means I can look at them and say, okay, cool. You're someone I'm not going to listen to anymore. Not going to talk to you. Not going to associate with. And then just exercise my right to ignore them and let them continue talking their nonsense somewhere else. Because that's fine. If people agree with them, cool. If they become dangerous, then we deal with that. But the speech in and of itself is not the problem. It is people's emotions and how they use them, I think. I got a question for me. Patrick J. again asks for me, if the Christian God was proven to exist according to my satisfaction, would I follow all of his commands or just some of them? And my little brother chimed in saying, being Drew's brother, I'd say he won't, for God, quote unquote, being an evil, cruel being instead of what the Bible says how, quote unquote, all loving it is. Aside from that, if we're talking about to my satisfaction, that's the thing though. I don't know to what level of evidence I would need specifically for me to apportion my belief to the point where I would say, okay, a God exists. More conclusively, that, okay, the Christian God exists. I don't know exactly what it would take to convince me of that. I really don't, because there are so many things, so many different ways that could go, and some of them even seem inherently contradictory in some form or fashion. I honestly don't know what my level of satisfaction would be in that situation. But to answer the question, would I follow all of his commandments or just some of them? Um, I honest the only honest way I can answer that question is I don't know, because are we establishing it, because which Christian God are we talking about? Because Eastern Orthodoxy has a different view on what God is or who God is than I would say even the Catholic Church does. I like y'all have different views on everything from essence and energies to doctrine to dogma and things like that. So with that much discrepancy just between what I would consider the two main sects of Christianity, I I honestly don't know if I would follow all the commands or just some of them or any of them, because I don't know which Christian God I'm dealing with.
If, for example, though, you were sure that it is a particular God that was true, and you're sure that that is actually the true God to your satisfaction, so putting aside these doubts between different ones, so you actually
Okay.
knew that it was the Jehovah's Witness God that was actually true, just
Right.
to
Okay.
take it
Okay.
away from
Okay.
which,
Okay.
which,
So yeah,
which,
if
and
we
you were
were if we
convinced of
remove
that, would
if we
you then
remove
follow all their
every
commands?
if we remove every semblance of nuance from the question, if I'm convinced and it's to my satisfaction and I'm convinced that the deity exists, I would, in my mind, I would have no choice but to follow that deity's commands in their entirety. I don't feel that I would have a choice in that matter, which actually goes back to my thing about free will. If a deity exists, I don't think anyone has free will at that point, especially not one that is omnipotent and omniscient. But I think we should probably save that and do a whole show just on that,
Yeah.
because that would
This
go
is
like
actually
way
really
that,
this
let's go like way off the rails here.
Yeah, no, actually, but do keep that in mind because that is actually a really fundamental point of, especially Orthodox Christianity and
Okay.
understanding its relationship and this whole question of what you're going through. This is
Hmm.
actually really quite an important issue. So we'll put that for another show
Yeah, definitely.
later on.
No. Okay. Well, hey, that's five. I've got you down now. Well, four after this one. So I'm happy to keep you on. Like, it's great. Okay, so Harry says, I have faith in God and believe, but I don't think he should be proved, and I'm not sure that it's possible to prove him. Okay, so we have an agnostic theist based on that statement, it seems.
Could
That's
you repeat again?
Harry Taylor. He's actually my co-host for when we were doing the Sunday live streams, essentially.
Yeah.
He says, I have faith in God and believe, but I don't think he should be proved, and am not sure that it's possible to prove him. So to me, that's agnostic theism, is it not? Or at least like a form of it, at least as far as proving it. I mean, I
Um,
guess. Well, no, he's saying he doesn't believe
I
it's possible.
actually,
So I guess it's not saying that we can't know. So agnosticism is
yeah,
probably
it's not.
it would be an
Well,
inappropriate term.
I'm not far from that position at all,
Really?
or from might be in the same point.
Okay.
It depends on how we. Well, actually, no, I am of the same point because ultimately, again, we're slightly slipping into metaphysics again, but
A little bit, yeah.
whatever is the deity is there is no principle, idea, thought, or anything preceding that deity. There is no way you can deduce the deity's existence because that would have to mean there's a prior thought, idea, principle that exists beyond or above or the existence of the God from which you can
Okay.
derive the existence of God. The God himself is the grounding of all reality, or grounding of all deduction. And so, in that case, you can have some sort of inductive arguments with the same limits as you have with scientific inductive arguments to prove God. But there is not impossible to have a deductive proof because that would have to assume that there's some principle idea that exists beyond or apart from God.
Right. I would say I would say deductively you could get us to a point of we have a hypothesis or a potentially workable hypothesis that a deity exists, and then it goes back to where I was coming from of at that point you must rely on induction to start giving any degrees of certainty to it. Um,
Yeah, if you want
and
to
then they
start
would still be
going
limited, that
certainly,
you would never be 100% because
no, of
I
course not.
don't
That's
think
why
you can really be
you
100%
can't
anything.
escape the faith issue.
Right. At that point you couldn't escape it. Um, so interesting. Okay. my younger brother asks what I think is actually a pretty interesting question. If God is proven, would it still be considered God?
Well, on the grounds which I just stated,
We couldn't prove God for
God
God to
is
remain
provable,
God.
so therefore wouldn't be God.
Right, exactly.
You,
So it's still an
yes.
interesting question. It's an interesting thought experiment at the very least, and I think it'd be interesting to see how other theists would react to that as well. So I might keep that kind of pocketed question to kind of throw out every once in a while. It's an interesting one. He has a question for you, Father Patrick. If someone says they are visited by angels and has brought a new chapter to be added to any part of the Bible, what would you do? So it's not even like a new book or anything, just a new chapter.
A new
Interesting
chapter to
question.
be added to the Bible.
Hmm.
Now, this is a complex type of question in experimentality. If it
Oh,
is
definitely.
suggesting that they found the sixth chapter to a certain book, which has got 5 chapters, they want to add it on, I would be highly, well, actually, no, I would say no, because in that sense, the canon of the scripture, the scriptures we have received is set, and that can't be changed. Anyone wanting to deliberately add even words into that thing, not that it's saying that scribes don't accidentally do it and it hasn't been little modification, but
Right, yeah,
deliberately
accidental
go and
slippage, yeah.
alter the text deliberately is contrary to the whole stability that that text has. And so this would be a deluded person to start thinking about this. Dream. Now, if they came along and said that some angels visited him and they said that God should say for a certain person at a particular time, now you should go over here,
Hmm.
perhaps that would need to be tested in a
I would
way.
say so, yeah.
My default, generally the default is Orthodox priest when someone says that is, yeah, right.
It's kind of a no. It's kind of a no there. Well,
We
yeah.
don't
Well, I mean, like I think we kind of see that issue with like the supposed adding of verses at the end of the book of Mark at the final chapter, like the disputed final few verses and whatnot.
Yeah, those actually, interestingly, those have been accepted into the general canon. So, though there is evidence that they weren't.
Some have, but some haven't. Like that, I found some versions of the Bible that actually don't record
Oh,
those
yeah, yeah,
last
yeah. Now,
verses.
the
Yeah.
modern Protestants will go, oh, we're not part of it. But as far as the Orthodox sense of preserving the tradition and the canon of the church, they have been
Right. Right.
accepted. They are part of our liturgical sense. But I understand the reason why, etc. But generally, yes, that's very ancient. Though the question about whether they or not, it goes way back into the early times. So, but if someone turned up now and tried to say, oh, I've got a new revelation to add on, it's like, no. We even Muhammad, when he started to talk about that, is already no. But
Right.
anyway, that's for our sense. But as I said, if an angel, someone's claiming to have a vision of angels, I couldn't say no. I would be, the general thing is take it with a really big pinch of salt, and if it's proved to be correct, then great, well, wonderful, very nice. But if it's
I'd be worried. I don't know, with as big a pinch of salt as someone would have to take for even something as small as that, as a non-theist, um, I would worry that that person's heart would stop. That's a lot of salt. It's a lot of salt. Not sure we could even do that with a dump truck, and I'm not sure that would be a big enough pinch, honestly. But anyway, anyway, the I think we've covered all the questions so far at this up to this point. So
right, we're
let's
talking
steer
about
things
lots of
back to
things.
government, back to the actual
Yeah,
topic
governments.
of the show
Yeah.
that we've so
So,
woefully steered away from, and we've been streaming for over an hour now. But
oh,
it's
that's
okay.
fine.
It's a discussion. It's an organic discussion. That's what it's supposed to be. So
So anyway, ideas are that the point is that I was trying to make is there is some form of belief system, even in a so-called secular government. You've got some form of ideological position, which is based on some level of faith, in a sense of some working hypothesis, even if you want to say theory of, if you think it's well established enough to do that. But let's say the hypothesis of what reality is, and so and that in ways informs the decisions about how the government acts. Now, why this is the two reasons why, well, there's a couple of reasons why this is dangerous. Not so much in the US. The US has a similar type of system to which I'm suggesting with the Constitution. But in other situations like the UK or etc., what actually boils down to is that once you secularize a government, then the authority, then what is the true understanding of a government is only reduced to human opinions. And in that case, what happens is that the opinion of those in power starts to take a lot more predominance. And therefore, if you have a particular ideological point of view which you get into power, you would start to bring that into society, start teaching that into society, and you start to mold society towards your ideological position by using your position in power. And my extreme cases, like something like communism, which comes in and puts its ideological position. Nazism is another way of doing that. And you can get that in modern times. What we've got now is a sort of, I don't want to throw out labels, etc., but say a liberal, liberal in the classic sense, sort of, usually politically correct. This is a fruit of the ideologic, which is coming in and starting to say, oh, you're not allowed to speak against, say, homosexuality, or etc. Oh, no, you must accept that women shouldn't just be mothers; they should go out into work and stuff. This has actually been taught through schools and imposed through schools into the children. The children are being bred and formed and transformed by this, because this is what the state holds. Now, someone as a Christian, some of these beliefs I find are actually throttling my ability to share why I understand reality and how people should work and what's best for us as human beings. I'm having a situation that's imposed upon me at an ideological level, at a worldview level, about how reality is and how people should work in it. And this is because these ideas, the people in power have got putting these forward. They might talk about human rights, but in fact, there's nothing stopping them slowly pushing these ideas forward through schools, etc., because they just make laws, etc., and say, no, you're not allowed to teach that. No, you can't do that. You can't do this. You get fired from your job if you start to speak in this way. You lose your rugby team if you stay this.
I definitely disagree with people just being forced to lose their job. I'm not a I have issues with the whole cancel culture thing and whatnot. To get into that for a brief moment, so I think what you're kind of disagreeing with, I'm not sure what a particularly correct term for it is, but the one I hear tossed around most of the time is neo-progressive. If I remember correct, I think is the common parlance from what I've heard from a few different sources, both on both sides of the typical political aisle, at least in the United States. What I will say about it is this: it's not that it's being forced or bred into the kids or anything like that, that women shouldn't be mothers or anything like that. What it is saying, at least as far as how I understand education, because I do have two children going through the American public educational system right now. My daughter is 12, my son is 11. And I am aware of the curriculum. I see the curriculum on a regular enough basis, and I try to stay up to date with it, try to stay abreast of what they're being taught and how they're being taught. And what I'm seeing mostly is at least right now, at least what I'm seeing is an emphasis on freedom of choice, in that yes, you are a young girl, your destiny doesn't have to be to grow up and be a mother. It's not required of you. There is no inherent requirement that you must do this thing. You are a human being who has her own agency and can make her own decisions. And based on that, you can do what you want to do. If you want to join the workforce, if you want to be a politician, be an engineer, or just be a stay-at-home mom, you have the freedom to do that within the society. What have been issues in the past with the American educational system is that inherently, and this usually comes from the older generations, sorry, I'm not trying to throw anybody under the bus, but statistically this bears out. And that is telling young girls, no, you shouldn't worry about messing with messing with the blocks or messing with the engineering or the math. That's a whole bunch of math. That's what guys do. That's what nerds do, and things like that. You should be on the dance team. You should be in the color guard. You shouldn't play a low woodwind or a low brass instrument because you're a girl. You shouldn't play trombone or baritone or tuba. You should play the flute. You should play the piccolo. These nice, dainty, light-sounding instruments and things like that. And so it's effectively comes across as this almost forcible engendering of inanimate objects, of things that have nothing to do with a person's gender, that has nothing to do with how they were born, but has to do with the choices that people make. So, and that's what I think is important to communicate to kids, is that they do have the choices to do essentially whatever they want to do. So if my daughter doesn't want to have kids and she wants to grow up and stay single and that's what makes her happy, and she wants to throw herself into a career in engineering or law or fashion design or movie set design or direct or any of those things, I'm going to be proud of her because I want her to be the best that she can be at what she does. And that's what I want for her. I don't care if she becomes a mother. If she wants to be, more power to her. That's fine. That's great. That's outstanding. But she's not required to. It's not her
Yeah.
responsibility to do that.
Yeah. Now, what I'm saying is that this is your worldview and stuff, and this
Yes.
is becoming the things taught. But I may disagree with that. That I may say actually it is proper for women to play this and the men to do this and stuff. But there should be a proper distinction between the genders and what you do with genders. This is not just something of free choice. So the fact that this is becoming, and if I try to teach my position, I would be in trouble, just as if you were 50 years ago with that system. That was just, again, another way of what's happening is that whatever group happens to be in power at the time basically has actually in charge of government does until it gets shifted by another group who gets into power and then expresses another particular idea, and then it might change again 50 years to another.
But the thing that would get you in trouble with teaching with teaching what you believe in an American educational institution or an American public educational institution, below the secondary level, like below the college level, K through 12, is if you're doing it for a particular religious reason, because of that separation of church and state. And the reason why is because if we were allowed that to be taught in a public school that is funded by the state, that is the state making a statement in support of a particular religion over another, and that's why that cannot be allowed, because
but the state in
because that
itself,
separation of church and state is supposed to be inviolate.
But the state, by prosecuting me, it is itself defining its view of reality of what's right for people. So when it's not about just faith, it's about how people act. Its view of how people should act, of the choices they should have, etc., is now being imposed on me, and that is still another ideological view. It's another worldview. It's just that's the one that's in power, and that this is the one that is now being imposed on the state schools, because this is the state. This is their ideological view of the state, and this is why it falls into secularism. It's just another ideological view along with mine. It's no better or stuff. If you say it has more right in a state school, then you're actually saying my understanding of reality is less important than the state's understanding of reality.
No, it's not even that. It's this: the state is running based so when it comes to education, the state runs based on the recommendation of what is accepted by the individual boards of education of each individual state. Those curricula are designed based on what is not what is in political power and things like that. Though someone's personal politics on a particular board of education can drive them to choose certain curricula. That being said, the reason for having multiple people on a state board of education is to override as much as possible individual ideologies and focus solely on, does this curriculum best teach what is the current consensus of the academic understanding of what this topic is, like when it comes to science or history. Because,
Well,
history, when I grew up, I kid you not, in my history, in my social studies book, there was a statement in there of Christopher Columbus setting sail in 1492 to prove that the world was round. There's a problem with that. You want to know what that problem is? What was invented in 1492? The globe, prior to his departure. Where we got that from, where that came from, is from a series of books published by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow called The Life and Times of Christopher Columbus. It was pop culture. That's all it was. It was a work of narrative historical fiction. It was not a history book, but it made its way into the curriculum based on misunderstandings. And so the educational system has to be a self-correcting system. It has to be able to shift and change over time based on how academic understanding over time changes. Otherwise, if we were to allow every, say, religion to have a say in how we teach science, we'd be left with next to nothing.
yeah,
There would be zero science education in this country. And so
the,
that's what that separation of church and state is for. Is it's not the state taking a position on what should be taught. The state's position on what should be taught is what is the consensus. It is it is the consensus that evolution
yeah,
is a
this
thing, and so we
this
should
idea
teach
of
that.
consensus, etc., is vague. Whose consensus? What consensus?
It's the
Which
consensus of those who are experts in the field, who
so
are
so-called
educated in that
academics,
particular field. Like, for
but
instance, I wouldn't go to a priest or a minister to inform my decision on how I should teach science to people. But also, I would not go to a biologist or or a physicist to tell me how or what curriculum or what should go into the curriculum for how I would teach someone theology or philosophy. So I
no,
would
no,
not consult them for that. It's about the specialization.
yeah,
And
no,
so
there's a good point on, and there's a good point on that. No, but I think you're right. So for physics or the specific topic of physics and stuff, where it gets interesting is not so much on those science topics, which are
okay.
specific things in themselves, but where it might get interesting is where it comes to sociology. So, in other words, how do we live? What
Well, we
roles do
don't
people
teach,
play in
as far as I'm
society?
aware,
How
we
do we
don't teach
relate to each
sociology
other?
at the K through 12 level.
Hmm?
As far as I'm aware, we do not teach sociology at the K through 12 level
Yeah,
because
yeah, you don't
it's
teach, but
considered a
what you're
soft
saying is
science.
that women can choose to do what they like, go where they like, play what instrument they like. That is what I'm talking about. This is
But that's not part
something
of a
that's
curriculum. That's not part of a curriculum in a school. That is just
yeah,
that's the culture itself.
yeah. That's exactly. It's for culture.
So it's not an educational issue. That's a cultural issue.
Well,
And you're
it's
free to say those things about the culture. And if you want to say those things in an educational sense in the United States, you can be a private educational institution and say whatever you like.
well, but then the state though has its own culture, and this culture is derived from its particular ideological views and stuff. And this is where the two start merging into each other. Anyway, we won't go into that too much. The more point I'm trying to state is that there is a sense that this it has changed, and it does change. Of course, it changes because the different people get into power, and culture is changed by a number of factors. Partly it's government led, partly it's not. Partly it's government follows along afterwards. It's not just a simple one way house. But
I would say primarily the culture changes and then the government it becomes altered to reflect that. And so it's not really the government or the state that really has much of a driving influence on things like that. It's the culture itself changes.
yeah,
Then that culture gets pushed into government and then the culture
well,
is going to
then
change again
sometimes,
later on.
yeah,
And
it's
so
sort of
it's a feedback loop is what it is.
it's a little bit of a feedback, yes. But there are interest groups who do make their way into politics to put their points view forward.
Oh yeah, no, I'm totally against all
And
special interest
these
groups. I
probably
don't
have
care
a
what they are.
disproportionate thing because most people don't actually care about government as long as government stays out of their personal lives and charges a minimal tax, but provides necessary infrastructure and protection, and people don't really care. So
basically, as long as it fulfills the legitimate roles of government and leaves the rest of us alone. Yeah.
Yeah, but there's also it's why it tends to be about in government. You actually tend to get more pressure groups and interested parties being involved and pushing a slight agenda into the government, because they're actually want to use this as a vehicle for their thoughts. But you're right. It's a feedback loop which goes around and round and round. Anyway, so
that's why they call it the American experiment.
But one of my questions is that ultimately, in any particular time, you're a little bit beholden to whoever's in power to what you can do in public space, for example. So US is quite fortunate in a sense. As I said, the Constitution helps a lot. So what you've got in the US, let's just go on from here. So my thing about it is, without some constraint, you're ultimately, whoever's in power, sort of in a sense,
you can tell everybody what to do, essentially.
Your freedom of thought is actually, in a sense, bound by whoever's in power, in a sense, the common culture of those in power.
Okay.
And so you can't really escape this. You can either have a system that just evolves.
Well, no. Human beings are inherently tribal. Like you take a whole bunch of people, don't tell them anything about each other, and you put them in and you put them in a building by themselves for a long period of time. They're gonna form tribes. Like this is inherent to human beings. It is inherent to our psyche. This is something that cannot be escaped. This is an evolutionary byproduct of our development. We are tribalistic.
I actually quite agree with you there. Well, there's ways of managing that. It's how we manage that is another question.
Right, and that's how we try to manage it is through forming an overarching culture, an overarching society by which we all kind of come together and agree on relatively loose things to kind of encompass everything, and then let everybody be their own individual tribes. Because I mean, when you look at the Constitution itself, when you look at just government as a whole, like there aside from two other countries in particular, India and China, the United States is the most populous country on the planet. We are the third most populous country on the planet, if I remember correct. And it's utterly insane. We have so many people, but we're separated by so much geography in a lot of ways, even with trying to shorten the distance with air travel and things like that, and even vehicular travel. It is still worlds different how things are going to be on the West Coast versus the East Coast. They do have quite a bit of overlap because there's a lot of back and forth with air travel and things like that. But then you have middle America, you have your flyover states and stuff like that. Even those states, a lot of them are incredibly populous. Like for instance, the UK on the whole, what's the total population is like what, 20 million people?
65. No, 65 million.
65, excuse me, 65 million people. There is more than that. If I remember correct, I believe we have either right close to that or more than that in the state of Texas. Or close.
Yeah,
no,
Texas is a big state. Texas is a big state.
Texas is a big state. You could fit the UK in Texas like 7 times almost. I think it's at least 4. It's like 4 or 5, maybe even 7. Like it's like the entire country of the UK is the size of a single United States state. And so I think that makes it a lot more difficult to try and govern in a country like the U.S. versus the U.K. because you have so much heterogeneity to the population because it happens. It's forced just through geographical separation.
But actually states is a good. Well, anyway, I'll keep plugging away a little bit, but yeah.
Okay, sorry.
No, but anyway, but there's states actually proves that you've got to be careful about how you do government in a sense, and that if you're true tribalistic in government, you
Mm-hmm.
will have this destruction of the states. Because if you're trying to pose it to particular tribalism, and the states can only work in some form of federalist way, and I think any government which is
And
central
that's
government
essentially
trying to
how the
centralize
U.S. is
too
steering
much,
towards.
and this is what can be happening a little bit. Either you go one religious right or other neo-progressive left. If that sort of tries to be ideological in the central government, you are going
Mm-hmm.
to have a rupture of the states, and you sort of see it a little bit at the moment. But politics, unfortunately, at that level is starting to break into this sort of almost two tribal camps, which is not good for the states. And they are forgetting that they should be just gently on top. Now, but so yeah, the government. So you've got to be very careful of governments in a sense. You can't escape. So I think, in a sense, is a delusion whether you're a secular government or that there is something that is sort of free from a sense of toleration or actually some form of judgment. You can't be truly pluralistic society in a sense. You've got to have something that is a bit more predominant
Yeah,
because
I'm not even entirely certain that you can truly have a pluralistic society at all, because if you just had true pluralism with no overarching governance of any kind, you'd essentially just end up with tribalism. Pluralism would devolve into
exactly.
tribalism, like in a very short span of time. I would say within 10 to 20 years, probably.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And
So you've got to have
this
some sort.
federalism system that what you're talking about, essentially being like one side gets in power, does a whole bunch of things, the other side gets in power, doesn't undo anything that they did, they just pile more crap on top of it, is exactly what's starting to happen here in the United States. Is Republicans get in power, piss off Democrats. Democrats get in power, piss off Republicans. And then back and forth and back and forth, and nothing ever actually gets done. And so it leads me to the point of where I personally consider to be our system of governance, and I would say most systems of governance are inherently broken because they rely too much on people inherently being something they're not. And that's altruistic. People are not inherently altruistic. People are greedy. People are
Oh,
inherently greedy.
but also I think for a stable society. So anyway, so there's the sense that I think some people get involved that the secular government sort of is sort of nice and objective to people, and we're all tolerant, and we look after people, and even if we've got the Bill of Rights, and I think no, you're just simply one ideology or another. The question is to me is how tolerant are you? If you go to an Islamic country, you've got your way of thinking. The Americans got its idea. The Islamic countries hate the American ideological position, how things should
Because
be
we're
done.
too tolerant, apparently.
And in the US has no idea, and they try to impose their ideological systems on the Middle East, and the Middle East are actually reacting more negatively to that because you actually fundamentally you think, oh, this is how people should live. We should have this rights and this right, and their cultures don't.
Well, yeah,
That's
exactly.
fundamentally
The
going
United
against.
States has turned into thinking that it's the police department for the entire world. I mean, like,
But at a
when
cultural level, at a cultural
yeah,
and
no, at a cultural level
level,
too, I
and,
agree with
and
you.
and this is why you get the ultra reaction because a lot of these Islamic countries were quietly un-Islamifying, but as soon as you try to come across and speed it up, impose yourself on them, you actually put the reactionaries back into it. But anyway, in the end,
I'm not even entirely convinced that that's totally the case because in a lot of ways, like that was that they were there was re-radicalization of Islamic countries even prior to a lot of Western involvement in the Middle East culture, like especially with the war on terror and stuff like that in the early 2000s, or even Desert Storm and Desert Shield going back to the early 90s. Look at the country of Iran. Iran is a great case study of this. Yes, it was going through essentially a de-Islamification. You look at Iran in the 1970s, their women are not walking around in niqab or burqa or anything like that. They're walking around westernized, so to speak. But fringe radical religious zealots started taking over with the ayatollahs, and then they just took power in Iran and forcibly reestablished a theocratic regime. and
Yeah, yeah,
that was without any real influence in the West. Not like strong influence like what you would see even in
yeah, yeah.
Afghanistan in the 80s with dealing with the Independence War, which, by the way, the United States was funding Osama bin Laden. We gave him a crap load of money in the 80s. People don't know that and don't like to think about that, but it's true. Look it up. Quit lying to yourself. Sorry.
That's okay. Big powers have to play the game of allies, and like no, go away, go away.
Yeah,
Anyway,
exactly.
but yes, no, you're right. It was soft Westernization, which got a radical revolt then, and there's sort of harder ones. It's not just, as you say, it's not purely harder. Sometimes it's a softer one which can resolve. But anyway, if we're truly tolerant, of course we should say that there's nothing wrong with the Islamic government if they want to run themselves and they run like that and have that. There's nothing wrong with that society, because that's the way they think society should be. Who are we to judge without actually
I
stating
would
it?
say that I would say there's a difference between tolerance and acceptance. It is tolerant to say that yes, they have their ideas about governance and how a government should be run, but that does not mean we're required to accept that. For instance, we can objectively look at things and look at people's overall happiness over periods of time, or whether or not they think they're happy, as well as overall things like economic success, objective things that we have subjectively determined are part of success and fulfillment. These are things that we have subjectively decided. Yes, I agree. Um, determine well-being, but also things that determine well-being are things like access to health care. I'm sorry, we can. I think it is entirely reasonable to say that people are better off in the United States than there are in, say, somewhere like Uzbekistan or Tajikistan, based solely on we have much better access to medical and health care in the United States than they do in those countries. In that way we can objectively say that our system has resulted in something that is better overall for people,
Well,
not
I don't know
necessarily
if
for
you can.
society, but for people in
I
general.
don't think you can say it's objective, really, because ultimately they, in their worldview, might believe living 20 years in their piety for religion and dying young is actually objectively, eternally much better than living 100 years with nice health and apart from your religion as beliefs, which is, yes, okay, you have a nice life here,
But
but
see, that's not their subjective statement. What I'm talking about is like actual actual well-being. I'm not talking about necessarily living to be 100 years old or anything like that. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the overall like holistic self, like the overall well-being, as in you don't have issues with cholesterol, you don't have breathing problems. If you have an issue with a limb that is not working as well anymore, you have the opportunity to say replace a bad knee, or you have the opportunity to have access to care that makes your quality of life not
yeah, but
not one of constant pain.
you're still talking about this on a health view, on a view that the health of a body and its functionality is core
Yes,
to the
because we can
well-being of the
objectively
person.
determine what is healthy because is the body functioning properly.
Well, you can make a correct objective view on what is a healthy body or not. Now, that's not in question. That is utterly correct. Whether that a healthy body is important in the overall spiritual, psychophysical reality of a human, but they understand is another matter. And they
Well,
might actually say,
so
actually,
we can
health
we
of
can
body
also
isn't
make
that
objective
important.
statements about the psychological aspect as well. It's like there's study after study after study that show that the that when you are healthy of body, you are generally healthier of mind, in that you have less instances of depression, you have less instances of self-doubt and things like body dysmorphia, where you're unhappy with how you look. Now, there are some people that still have that even in healthy bodies, and that's what leads to things like anorexia and bulimia nervosa, these eating disorders and things like that. These are psychological maladies that people do suffer from. However, we can say that on the whole, that yes, even despite that these things exist, such as anorexia and bulimia, we can still say on the whole that being in a healthy body that is free from disease, that does not have a lot of adverse issues going on with it, you are generally going to be healthier in your mind. You are generally going to be psychologically healthier. It is a total physiological package there. And
Yeah, okay.
we can make that statement objectively. And
I
so
suppose I'm
that
talking
allows us to
about
determine that at
in
least
its
that
spiritual
aspect of
sense as
Islam
well.
is incorrect.
Well, you could talk about the
If that were
spiritual.
like a governing tenet, I mean,
Yeah, yeah. Now you could talk about the spiritual level. The body suffering and stuff is actually good for you. That bodily health isn't that important because the spiritual thing. These things are, they might be right in their religion, or I'm making a religious statement about whether I agree with that. I'm actually stating what I think is a priority of well-being by making a statement that the way they run the country, what they prioritize is good or bad. We are actually making a worldview statement to them about what is to be of a priority for them. And so, in a sense, we can't really say anything about any state unless, well, we can. Well, of course we can. You can say, in my view of reality, you guys are really stupid. But you can't actually make an overall statement in an objective sense that you are wrong, but unless you are willing to state that your metaphysics, your worldview, your sense of reality is actually distorted or wrong, which is a different level of discussion.
which we do have queued to start up in 2 weeks from now, actually, to start a discussion on metaphysics.
Yeah. We'll
Sorry, I was sneaking in a quick plug there.
That's right. Now, anyway, so they've got all these different rules and stuff like that. You can't, and you've just got one system to another. If you like one, well, you may like one or another. You might prefer to live. I prefer to live in a country which is a good health system. Sure, but I also see there's some inherent dangers with that. As a spiritual person, that there are some traps with these societies, and in the sense that the bodily care becomes a god in itself, an end in itself, and it's easy to be tempted by that. And it's an over priority where other values of human life, such as freedom, etc., suddenly get out of proportion. And this is actually a real issue with COVID, because the drive for bodily health and protecting people for life and well-being has, in a sense, started to distort some other things about the benefit of human engagement, regardless of whether we get sick. The fact that we actually keep meeting to each other and keep some social context.
So I have to interrupt you here for a moment on this one, Father Patrick, and this is just to. I'm not saying that you're not free to make your point or anything like that, but I think that that's something we should probably discuss in private. And the only reason why I say that is not because I don't want you to be heard or anything like that, but YouTube and the YouTube algorithm has a dangerous thing going on right now where anything that mentions what you just mentioned, they tend to pull down the video, and I don't want that to happen.
Right.
Because I think we've had a really good discussion up to this point, so I think we should steer away from this topic, and I'm sorry about that.
No, I understand.
The YouTube overlords have spoken.
But the issues of tech.
Yes, I know. I have issues with Susan Wojcicki myself.
But anyway, I'm making my point in the sense that, in a way, there's different ideologies. And so the way I'm thinking of government, which was going back to the Roman Empire, was actually something which is the US is not too far different from this. Is where the Roman government actually realized that Christianity was the right, perfect religion for empire. And what it allows, and it has a right distinction of church and state. It's like, right, we're all going to share a common value system about what reality is, how we behave, our common sense of what reality is, our common sense of the core human values of behavior. And that is going to be protected, not by the government, so it's not going to be controlled by whoever's in power directly. It's controlled by the priesthood, who are not in the government. They're not allowed to be in the government. The priesthood determine, according to their rules, the preservation of this. And the government gets on with dealing with secular things, but not in a secular ideological way, or not with a separate, religion has a separate thing from it. No, we all share the same worldview. but we will deal with the secular matters. We've got power over the armies, etc. We elect the rulers by ourselves. The church may bless us, but we have our own secular order of how we choose it, even if it's civil war or someone stabbing someone in the back. That's a secular means. The church interfere or argue that they're not morally in the right place, because that's a secular way of putting the emperor into place. And we won't go around and now this actually works. I think actually lasted for an empire for 1,000 years. Now there's abuses. Sometimes the church would get too much power. Sometimes emperors would try to impose themselves. But in the end, the stability of a system came back. So if an emperor tried to impose his view, what would happen about at least within 100 years, the traditional system would re-establish itself. Because I think there's a really strong sense of how the priesthood, because everyone goes to the church, infects the way people think in their culture and their minds, and those people come back into power. So emperor going off his head for a little while doesn't actually fundamentally change things for a long time. He might try to impose it. And also, interestingly, trying to do things by force doesn't change things. Now, this system actually works well. So, and you're free now. You can free to criticize the government on the tradition of it. So, hey, you're a bad emperor. You've just gone and murdered 10,000 people without reason. Repent. And the emperor, ooh, sorry.
But the question is, are they also free to criticize the theocracy that is running, that is kind of preserving and running things in the background? In the background, I mean, not the actual current government, I guess the theological powers in the background. Right, because you said you're having the priesthood essentially preserve certain things and preserve the moral, the moral entity of the empire and whatnot. So, okay, are people free to criticize that?
Yes. Now, generally, people, this is where Christianity actually is allowed, you're tolerant. But if people start causing views, what they'll do is they'll actually sit down and they'll call a council of all the bishops all around the world. So it's not like a small enclave of 5 people. We're talking about people globally coming together who are actually in the church system are not beholden to each other. So that's why there's a sort of federalism in the church. There are senior churches to allow for coherence of unity, but they're not controlling each other. So they have a large level of independence. So there's no sort of centralized control over them. And so when the government got an issue of this, the emperor goes, right, come together and tell me what is the case. And then they do that, and the government say, right, well, this is a testimony from all the bishops from all over the world who are independent from each other, and they've all come to a common voice. You're arguing against it. You are actually now becoming destructive to the harmony and unity of the empire, and therefore we'll put aside your views, because if you keep them going, you'll erode the common state.
Well, but see, okay, so that in an essence of itself is an erosion of freedom. Because now the person, okay, you're telling that person, we're not allowing your views to matriculate further, so you're restricting them from expressing them. At which point you are essentially eroding that freedom.
You're not just saying that you're not views. You're actually listening to their views and saying you're actually wrong. Your views are not actually valid. Your views are wrong. They've been judged as being false. They're not correct views.
Well, if you're speaking against it, but still, that's a bit of a problem, though. That creates a bit of a problem in and of itself, though, because okay, say one person comes out and says, I disagree with this aspect about the religion itself. I feel that this view is incorrect. This view is, for whatever reason, doesn't matter what the view is, that this view is incorrect. Okay, but now you're leaving it to the religion to judge whether or not it's incorrect, and then tell this one person you're wrong. That is wildly biased. There's like a big problem with that. Because the entire process, even if these bishops are essentially independent of each other in most cases, you still have this overarching coherence that is actually rooted in governing all of them. So essentially you're having one body checking itself and telling itself, well, actually this is wrong, and then presenting that to the emperor who is just essentially relaying a message saying, you know what, well, they say that they're not wrong, and there's a lot of them and one of you. I'm going to go with what they said. That's incredibly biased and does not work.
Oh, actually, it did work. It worked quite nicely for 1,000 years. The question is that whether now this is assuming that there is a truth
Just
to
because
this,
an empire
and
existed for
the
1,000
system is
years
correct.
doesn't mean that that system was working, or it doesn't mean that that system was good for the people. It just means
Well,
that it perpetuated the existence of the state.
well, not necessarily the perpetual rights. It was good for people in many ways. The Roman Empire was extremely rich, and people, everyone outside the Roman Empire wanted to be part of it. Though many people end up pulling it to pieces to try to claim part of it.
A
But
lot of that
anyway,
had to do with
fair enough. Now,
the
I
introductions
can't
of Caesars.
prove from this point on. I can't prove that is the best. Well, I can argue for the best system, but I'm saying that the system itself, I think, is the best way for empire. Now, I'm not saying this is a specific religious body and stuff. Now, let's go to the US, for example. You've got the Constitution. The Constitution is set in stone. You have a Supreme Court, which is the guardian of the Constitution. Now, if what you do, I don't like the Constitution. I don't like the idea of freedom of speech. That's my opinion. And so you do something that gets appealed into court, and the Supreme Court will go, no, that's wrong. That's not considered to the Constitution.
But that's not your only avenue. But that's not your only avenue to work with at that point. The other aspect of it is you actually have a very difficult process set out before you, but it is not an impossibility, and that is to essentially garner a convention of the states, something that is actually able to be done in times of feeling that the Constitution needs to be edited or needs to be amended again, or we need
Yeah.
to repeal an amendment. You would need to get a supermajority of the states. That would be 33 of the states. I mean, I think as of right now, to have a constitutional convention, and then you would have the ability to try and convince them that the First Amendment is bad and that we need to get rid of it. So,
Okay.
so the SCOTUS, the Supreme Court, is not the final arbiter at this point.
Okay, so unless you go to the state of change, asking them to change, there is still a state where your view would be judged wrong by the state, by the guardians of the Constitution, not by the federal government, but by the guardians, which is the Supreme Court. And so you would have to then convince the entire society, which is a mechanism to change the law. But nevertheless, you still have a guardians of the Constitution, which ideally is stable. You don't want it to change constantly or too easily, as you demonstrate. That would cause a problem. Now, so this is actually very, very similar, and it's a Constitution which is not too heavy. In other words, it allows quite a lot of.
Well, no, it was designed to be a small central government. It was designed to be a loose, small central government that was really only useful essentially in times of great conflict. That's what it was. That's what it was initially designed to be. It was designed to just be the idle watcher in case something really bad happened, and then it has its use, and then everything else is left to the states to decide for itself. But the only thing it actually is deciding is saying that there is no state religion, and so every state can have whatever religion it wants.
Yeah, but then you can't have a state religion in each state. I mean,
no,
Texas
and you shouldn't.
The Baptist, for example, is at its constitutional level. Texas can't say we're a Baptist state, and
right, but you would not believe how much control certain Baptist churches have over local governments.
Oh, look, yeah, people
like,
have.
Oh my gosh, okay. So I'll bring one up in particular. Smith County, Tyler, Texas, is a place where I used to live. This is a town of 120, 130,000 people now. Was essentially entirely ruled by this single organization, Green Acres Baptist Church. And this is why that county, Smith County, was dry for decades. Dry meaning you cannot purchase alcohol inside that county. I didn't know if that was a common parlance in the UK or not, so it's...
Yeah, I understand it.
Okay, cool. So that's what made Smith County a dry county. That has since been overturned, but most places just sell beer and wine. But you want to know what one of the primary drivers behind Green Acres Baptist Church maintaining their authority in that way and why they kept pushing to have um, low having Smith County be dry. They claimed, a lot of them, that it was for religious reasons because most Baptists are teetotalers. They don't consume alcohol of any kind. It's not what God wants them to do, according to them. But apparently, God doesn't have a problem with them selling alcohol to every Tom, Dick, and Harry that wants to buy it. Because it come to find out that several of the small mom and pop little liquor stores just over the county line in places like Gregg County and other counties bordering Smith County were suspiciously owned by higher up members of the congregation of Green Acres Baptist Church. And so this is one of the things where I find that having religion involved in governance is inherently damaging to both. Um, in as much as it is a mutually corruptive system, because you have the churches, which ostensibly, um, eh, depending on regardless of denomination, ostensibly are there to have control over the spiritual with people, the moral fiber, all that stuff. The moral fabric of society is generally how the church is seen in most aspects, especially in Texas. But then you have the government, which is not not the moral fabric, but the ultimate authority over what we deem legal based on information given to us by the moral fabric, because they're the voting bloc, they're the voting constituency. But when you start meshing the two, and you have the people that are the main voting constituency, especially those that are in this very wealthy church, who are now in power and making the decisions of the legislation or putting forth the legislation of essentially forcing their particular religious belief on this county and imposing it under the threat of violence, because any law that you enact is under threat of violence. We obey it under threat of force, because that is how government works. Government is enforcing something. You are forced to do it. It is a forced compliance in some way, shape, or form. When you combine those two things, every time that I've seen it done throughout history, throughout American history and world history, it becomes a mutually corruptive thing. Because look at how things happened when the head of state also became the head of faith in the UK. Looking at Henry VIII and the Anglican Church, it became insanely corrupt
Oh,
and nearly destroyed the country.
yeah,
And
but
that is inevitably what happens when you have religion involved in government or with governance in any real way. And so it seems as though, based on how humans think and how humans act over time, it's an inescapable thing that we need to keep religion and governance separate.
well,
And
yeah,
if we don't do that, they're mutually corrupting forces as soon as they
well,
get involved with each other.
I think what you need, I think the point I was trying to make today is that
Okay.
you can't actually separate the two. You cannot have a so-called government which is abstracted from a world view, a understanding of
Well, no,
cultural.
but a worldview is not by necessity a religion.
Well, no, it's not necessarily. It has to be a religion. It's still a worldview. It does. Well, I'm talking about worldviews. I'm talking about ideology, because I'm talking about understanding society, way we understand reality. We cannot escape some form of at least hypothesis and we base our decisions and our ultimately how we act as people on this sense of what reality is, and we can't escape that. So you may not like it. So whether it's a religious constitution maintained by churchmen, or whether it's a secular constitution maintained by a Supreme Court, or whether it's whatever. No, you're still going to. It's still going to have the same. It's still going to be the same thing. You can't just sort of take it away. What you can do, though, is separate secular authority and power from the constitutional authority and power, as a separation of the judiciary from the executive in the states, and again a separation of that from the legislative authority.
So we are going to have to kind of bring this to a close here in just a few minutes, because we've been going for almost a little over 2 hours now, which quite frankly I could go all day on this topic alone. I would kind of like to introduce you to one little thing that I've been kicking around real quick.
Yeah.
And it is insanely radical, I would say. And but from a scientific standpoint, it actually seems to have a weird chance of potentially working. And that is a kind of something along the lines of a lotocracy. The term lotocracy I found on another video on YouTube, but I believe the appropriate term is sortition or stococracy, essentially election by lottery. There is no actual election. It is just you have everybody's information, and they are randomly selected. At that point, you can't actually have a governmental worldview, especially if you implement a few other key issues and stuff like that. Like for me, one of the biggest problems I see with American politics and really all political systems across the entire country that have democratically held elections or representative republics, whatever, however you want to determine it, is career politicians. Because then that's how you get an ingrained worldview in government, and it's an inescapable one. Well, a lotocracy actually actively prevents that, actually passively prevents that, just by its sheer nature, in that it's a random selection, because it's not beholden to what individual people want to pick and whatnot. But at the same time, a person cannot be a career politician. It's impossible for them to be, because there is no guarantee that they're going to be selected again by this random selection process at the end of their term. So at that point, if there's any kind of worldview that becomes consistent at a federal level, it's gone in 2 to 3 years.
So you've got to be careful that with the elected government, there's also the institutional civil service, for want of a British word.
Right. No. That kind of stuff wouldn't change. Like civil employees, like postal workers, police officers, the things of that nature. I am purely talking about offices that we currently hold elections for, specifically like the House of Representatives, the Senate. Executive branch do away with. They're designed to just be a figurehead anyway. They're not supposed to have any real power, yet they keep assigning themselves power with every successive term that any one person serves as president in this country, and that's not what the executive branch was ever designed to do. It was designed to have singular veto power that is very limited when it comes to legislation, and that veto power can be overridden by the legislative branch. So essentially, the executive branch is pretty much just a formality of, if you want to be angry at that guy right there, and yell at him. Don't yell at us, yell at him. Essentially, it seems like the executive branch is just designed to be a scapegoat, especially nowadays. Oh my gosh. But you would still have to have some kind of consistency, right? So my proposition at that point would be that the Supreme Court, since it's supposed to be the preservation of the Constitution itself, that they still serve for life, unless they are found to be, distinctly and medically determined to be mentally deficient, as in like they have, they succumb to Alzheimer's, because people of advanced age unfortunately do succumb to that. I think if we had had better testing for Alzheimer's and things like that, perhaps Ronald Reagan may not have served the last 2 years of his presidency, because it seemed like the symptoms were starting to show. Not that I have anything particularly against him as a person or as a president in one real way or another, just that, that could have potentially been an issue at that time. And so, to that end, the legislative process wouldn't actually change.
Yeah, it's interesting how the Supreme Court actually has been so politicized over time as well.
Oh, I know. Yes,
And, and, and,
we only had five Supreme Court justices all the way up until 1890. Or no, excuse me, in 1895, I think we had five Supreme Court justices, and then I, I can't remember if it was it was in the 20th century that we saw the expansion up to nine justices, and I can't remember if it was Woodrow Wilson or FDR that actually just said, okay, well, fine, you don't want to confirm the people I want confirmed. I'm just going to do an end run around the Constitution, say here we need two more people on the Supreme Court, and they're going to be my people. And so it's like, and now we're seeing an attempt at court packing already trying to be in the works again now to add four more justices to turn it into a 13 seat court and to try and politicize it, and it is just it's I have issues with that, but anyway, I'm sorry.
Let you go. But anyway, your interesting thought there, which actually reinforces the very points that I'm trying to bring out, is
right.
that we recognize the same problem with the various systems and things like that. As I say,
it's just that my system or my proposed solution is not to run to a different form of authority or a different form of governance in as such as to involve more people in the process, but to involve less. And not to invoke any particular deity, but to use, demonstrable mathematical principles and science by which to reach what I think could be a well evidenced and useful thing, something that would actually be good for the people, for the governed, because then you don't really have politicians that can be influenced. Not really, because it makes no sense to influence them. Because they're not going to be there forever. They're going to be there for a very short period of time. So there's very little damage that any one group can do. And you institute a single. So, well, no, well that's the idea. Is like we see how much damage people can do over short periods of time. But the thing is since the selection process is randomized, essentially, you're the way the legislative process I would have, where I would want it to work as, would be, have a panel of experts to educate legislators before the first draft is even considered at that point. But at that point, it introduces a point of corruption in that, well, okay, well, maybe you can pay off the panel, so to speak, right? Not so. I have a way around that as well. You randomly select the panel too, but from within the fields of expertise. And so you're randomly selecting from within that field of expertise. So for a special interest group or a particular company, whether it be an oil company or anything else, to try and actually garner some control over the political process or over the legislative process, they would be hemorrhaging money to the point of bankruptcy, because the only way they could even try to guarantee that they have their finger on the person who is going to be helping write the legislation and educate the representatives on that legislation would be to try to pay off literally every single person in that field of expertise on a constant basis, on the hope that one of them is going to get selected.
Yes, and we just need to hope that whoever is doing the randomizing choosing system is not someone who's actually worked out the quantum physics behind it and is able to determine the result every time.
Well, see, that's the thing, though. It's that quantum physics. But the thing, though, with that is that quantum physics doesn't actually have anything to do with statistics. Not really. Quantum physics mostly is to do with things on the extreme microscopic level when it comes to like subatomic particles and things like that, and quantum probability. When you get to the macro, Einsteinian relativity still works phenomenally well and works constantly.
Oh, indeed. If I can control, the micro level, and then control whatever random process is to the nth degree, and then determine the result by actually determining the way the ball rolls out of the cylinder.
True. But see, here's the thing: is you would actually have to try. But the way around that, is you just keep changing the machine. Because at that point,
It just
unless
makes it
you
more difficult. Yes.
it's going to make it a lot more difficult to the point where they can never really have any real degree of certainty within, I would estimate, between maybe a 1 in 10 chance at best in most cases. Because my idea is is essentially use a computer with a random number generator. And the only constant in that process is that we're pulling social security numbers from the Social Security Administration to feed into the machine itself
As long
to
as the
do the random
machine
selection.
is under somebody's protection, that it is not corrupted with code that unrandomizes the randomization process.
Right. Well, see, the thing is, the way to deal with that at that point would be to like there are levels of security you can take to the nth degree and stuff like that. There's always going to be some way to try and corrupt the system, but what you have to do is do everything that you can to prevent that corruption. And one of the ways to do that would be, okay, have, say, the person or people guarding it. The most effective way for them to guard it is to not know what they're guarding. Tell them they're guarding something totally different,
Indeed.
and only have a couple of people that actually know that. But then not only that, you change them out constantly, or you change out the machine itself, or you keep moving it. You know,
You've
you
got to
constantly
have something constant though in the whole process, and that's where it could be a weak point. I'm not sure exactly what, but in a sense, who's deciding who's changing who out and where, and and or what is there going to be some rule which is set down that this is going to be done? Everyone has to follow the rule. What happens if people stop following the rule? You still get to something where the system has to have some sort of regularity or some rule which is
right. Well, see, here's the thing: is there's actually ways to try and control for that too. It's insanely difficult to do, but it is possible. And it comes with it comes with the randomization of what I would call nonsense legislation, such as like naming post offices and things like that. You can use the internal choices from things like naming post offices to use that aggregate metadata from votes and use that to determine some random number just based on that to say where do we send this thing next.
yeah. But even still, the whole system sort of that you've got to have everybody buying into it, or
Oh yeah,
you've got
yeah.
to
No,
have
it
quite a
would be
big system
insanely
of
difficult,
people
nearly
who are
impossible to implement.
maintaining it without, and that gets tricky. But
Oh
anyway,
yeah,
it's
no,
very
definitely.
interesting.
Yeah, it's a fun little thought experiment. Like I said, it's a fun little thought experiment. But anyway, oh gosh, it's almost 4:30 here,
Yes,
which means it's almost 10:30 for you. So I'm sure we need to go ahead and start winding things down, so that because you already
it's.
stay up until 1
Oh,
and
well,
2 in the
this is
morning
my
reasonable.
bedtime now. It's actually it's fine. This has worked out fine because normally I start the shows in another hour's time from now.
Yeah, exactly. I'm well aware of
But
that. Gosh.
if I get to bed about 11 o'clock, that works out fine.
Okay.
So
Well,
this is
let's go ahead and call it here for this discussion. As deep as we've gotten into the issue, especially with our random tangent that went on for almost an hour, we may have to do a government part two before we even get to metaphysics. But we can discuss that at a later time. So. I would like to say to everybody who tuned in watching today, thank you very much for tuning in. Please go follow Reason Theology and look at the videos that Father Patrick has been involved in, especially the Stump the Apologist episodes, because, well, number one, I'm on there too, but also you get to see kind of all of us interacting in an off-the-cuff, kind of random manner, and how we answer questions as they come in from people like you who are watching. So I think you guys might find that interesting. Also, feel free to go through and watch other episodes here on this channel. Father Patrick has been on before with the discussions of the Theist episodes, and we're looking forward to having him on for more. So until next time, Father Patrick, thank you for being part of the discussion today.
welcome. My pleasure.
And everybody watching, thanks for tuning in, and we will see y'all next time. Have a great night.